Hello, it's me, Steady Eddie, from the YouTube. The rift between Endgame players and, well, the rest of an MMO's player base can be tumultuous at times. Endgame players want a balanced, competitive environment where their dedication to the game is highly rewarded. They've often spent the most time on the game, know its combat systems back to front, and demand a lot from the game's developers. So what happens when they're not catered to? It's time for a discussion video. When I'm not drinking myself silly or rapping about content creators, I actually care about the games I play. And today, I want to talk about The Elder Scrolls Online and the decline of its endgame. It may be news to those who don't play much ESO or who play it casually, but it's been common knowledge in the ESO community for a while that the endgame player base has been in decline. Raid and prog groups are struggling to fill up, PvP is dead on almost every server, and all this came to a head in the announcement for Update 35 when the most prominent Discord server for PvE carry groups shut down overnight. I'll get to Update 35 later. Having said this, by all other metrics, ESO is a relatively healthy game. Its Steam charts show fairly consistent numbers, and according to MMO population, its subscriptions have been steadily rising. So what's happening? To answer this question, we need to go all the way back to the start. ESO is fairly unique in that its endgame was originally supposed to be open world PvP in Cyrodiil. Many called ESO the successor to Dark Age of Camelot, and core members of the Dark Age team were also involved in the creation of ESO's Cyrodiil, a faction v faction v faction, open world dynamic PvP zone with keeps to capture and emperors to throne. The combat system was also largely designed around PvP. All skills had only a 1 second global cooldown, which led to a fast, reactive combat system. This was polarizing, and many MMORPG fans hated the combat, and still hate it to this day. However, the combat system was unique enough that, despite the game's horrendous launch due to other reasons, it still brought in a dedicated hardcore player base. Upon the release of the game, if you wanted to play with a friend, you had to pick the same faction, either Daggerfall Covenant, Ebonheart Pact, or Aldmeri Dominion, God Save the Queen. If you picked different factions, you quite literally couldn't play with each other, even in PvE areas. Although this is a fairly dumb decision for an MMO, a genre which thrives on being social, it led to players being incredibly dedicated to their factions. In those days, the norms would be to farm gear and trials in the daytime with your guildmates, and then head to Cyrodiil in the evening to fight for your faction. People were dedicated to the point that if you ever changed factions, you'd be cast off as a traitor and risk losing contact with everyone you talked to before. This happened to me, by the way. I'm talking about me. This was all until the 1 Tamriel update. Many people will know 1 Tamriel as the update that saved The Elder Scrolls Online. And in player numbers, it did. The release of 1 Tamriel was in October 2016, and by November 2016, its concurrent player base had tripled on Steam charts and continued to gradually increase. Please just note that most people play ESO through its standalone client, but ZeniMax hasn't released numbers for that. So for now, we will have to use Steam charts. So, what did 1 Tamriel do? Well, a lot. It battle leveled all characters, so you would always be scaled to an enemy's level, even if you're level 5 and they were max level. It removes level restriction on grouping, so you could group with a friend without rolling an ult. It removed the alliance restriction, so you could go to any zone. It added almost 30 new sets, added different difficulty modes to dungeons. The update saved the game because it made it so much more accessible. However, I'd like to argue that 1 Tamriel created a problem that hasn't been addressed yet 6 years on, and has ultimately resulted in the collapse of the endgame community. One of the things that they also did in 1 Tamriel is redesign Craglorn. Now, Craglorn was the very first piece of additional content in ESO and was a difficult, overworld PvE zone designed specifically for 4-man groups. It created a way for friends to do endgame difficulty content while also experiencing the open world and stories of Tamriel, and without the restrictions of a dungeon or a trial. In 1 Tamriel, they changed this to be soloable. You no longer had to group with anyone to do the group content. This was the first inkling endgame players got that ZeniMax were happy to cast them aside in lieu of bringing in new players. The other thing that happened is that with the opening up of all zones to all factions, players became less attached to their faction, and thus less bothered about going to PvP. There was a realization by ZeniMax that Elder Scrolls players, well, they just wanted to play Elder Scrolls. It makes sense. And the stories and world of Tamriel and being able to experience that with friends or even just on your own is more attractive to an Elder Scrolls player than any kind of hardcore MMO experience that was being offered before. Whereas before endgame elements were a key part of their advertising, it was now about offering an Elder Scrolls experience. In 2017, they doubled down on this with the release of Morrowind, bringing in players who basically wanted to experience the island of Vvardenfell in HD. The release of Morrowind also brought Battlegrounds, a 4v4v4 PvP arena with different game modes, and each match lasting 15 minutes max. Bearing in mind that it is now 2022, this was the last major addition to PvP. There has been no new major content for PvP for 5 years straight. ESO went from being a game focused on its PvP, even using it as a USP, to not adding any new major content for 5 years. Now, is this bad? MMOs can and should have license to change. ESO probably wouldn't exist anymore if the One Tamriel update hadn't happened. But this is kind of the crux of the problem. Previously, the game was a difficult MMO experience that simply had an Elder Scrolls skin, and it had a player base to reflect that, whereas One Tamriel positioned it as a direct extension of the Elder Scrolls universe. Although it had brought in enough Elder Scrolls players to save the game, there was also a large group of disgruntled endgame players that fell in love with the combat system, the open world PvP and difficult PvE zones, but now felt cast aside. Another thing that I didn't mention is that open world Cyrodiil faced, and is still facing, massive performance issues. Skills not working, bugs, insane lag spikes. At times the game is unplayable and has been for the last 7 years. Although it seems they are close to a solution now, back in 2016 it probably would have been hard to continue to make its open world Cyrodiil a key part of the advertising, when physically it just did not work. And now to update 35. Remember about the carry Discord that shut down? This was a direct result of the combat changes that ZeniMax proposed in the Update 35 patch notes. There had been a number of changes to combat in the last 1 to 2 years leading up to Update 35 that had already caused players to leave the game. For example, they hybridized every skill in the game. Previously, there used to be stamina-based classes and magicka-based classes, such as a magicka Dragon Knight that used fire, or a stamina Dragon Knight that mainly used poison. They both had distinct identities, whereas now, there was just Dragon Knight. This was a major adjustment to the core mechanics of ESO's combat system, and many people didn't like that. They also made a series of changes that lowered the skill ceiling of the game. For example, making it a lot easier to sustain your resources. Whereas being able to sustain your skills used to be a major part of the skill gap in ESO, it's just now incredibly easy to sustain. Before in PvP, you had to pick and choose what you wanted. Higher damage with less sustain, more tanky but less damage. You had to make sacrifices and learn to play around your weaknesses. Now you can be tanky, have a lot of damage, have a lot of sustain and a lot of healing without making any sacrifices. These types of changes felt like a slap in the face to a lot of top tier endgame players who had spent time learning the combat system to the highest degree, only for it to be changed massively. Update 35 was the final straw for a lot of players when ZeniMax announced 2 things. The first was that they were changing light attacks to a flat value, whereas before it scaled off your stats. This is a major change because light attack weaving has been a core part of the game since its launch. Light attacks don't follow the same 1 second global cooldown that skills do, so to maximize DPS, you hit a skill, then a light attack, then a skill, then a light attack, etc, etc. Doing this with perfect timing can increase your DPS by a very significant amount. By nerfing light attacks to a flat value, it makes this mechanic way less important, and also decreases overall DPS by a significant amount. The other change was to increase the length of all damage over time abilities and self buffs. Before, all self buffs and dots lasted around 10 seconds, give or take, meaning you had to recast them often in a rotation, whereas now they were changing them to last 20 to 30 seconds. This meant that combat had been majorly simplified, and for large parts of a rotation, you would mainly just be spamming one button. Players were annoyed by that. Beyond the fact that DPS was potentially being lowered, it would just become very boring to do. This is what ultimately led to the shutdown of the biggest PvE carry server overnight. To rub salt in the wound, ZeniMax said that these changes were made to make it easier for new players to get into trial groups, when they actually made it a lot harder. You see, in ESO, There are dynamic rotations and static rotations. A dynamic rotation is the optimal DPS you can achieve, with an ever-shifting skill pattern to minimize the downtime on dots and buffs. A static rotation, on the other hand, is a set pattern of skills that the player does over and over again. It's a lot less to remember and enables a way for newer players to achieve decent DPS. However, the changes to the buff and dot lengths to different timings has been done in such a way that creating a static rotation for a lot of classes is kind of hard now, and ultimately will lower your DPS by quite a lot compared to before. This, along with the overall decrease in DPS, has actually made trial completion significantly harder, and has done the exact opposite of what ZeniMax intended it to do. Along with all the other changes, this has created a massive distrust of ESO's combat team from the player base, and has resulted in what is pretty much a mass exodus of endgame players. ESO is an MMO that will always struggle to balance the demands of both its endgame player base and its core Elder Scrolls player base. It started as a fairly hardcore MMO experience, but has turned itself into a very casual-friendly experience. Is this bad? Not necessarily. Despite the looming death of its endgame, its player numbers remain high. They're clearly still making money, and an MMO is ultimately about being a social experience, which the game still offers. However, it does make me worried. Endgame players are often the players who hold companies to account. They play the game the most, and care about it enough that they call out the bullshit. It's no secret that ZeniMax's monetization practices have been increasingly shifty as of late. But who cares if you're just someone who hops on and plays the game casually every now and then? Who cares if they flip the combat system upside down? It will be interesting to see what ZeniMax does next, whether they double down with what they're doing or try to get the original core player base back. Thank you for watching, and please like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video.
Like and subscribe, please. Please, I need you to like and subscribe, please. I'm begging you. I'm begging you.